Yeah. I think I can't say it's singular, but it's unique.
Okay. He started out also at ASU with bachelor's, master's, and PhD in I'm blanking here.
Electrical engineering.
Electrical engineering, but took a brief foray into industry at MIT Lincoln Lab, which I guess is kind of industry, and Raytheon. And his work has been featured in NPR, Wall Street Journal, ESPN, New York Times, and etc.
All right. Thank you. Thanks. So very happy to be here. This is a fairly diverse crowd. So the set of things I'll be talking about today are at sort of a level of abstraction up here. And if you're interested in a deep dive in any of these, I'm more than happy to oblige, either during lunch or later when cocktails are available. So this is joint work with Julie Liss and an army of graduate students and postdocs. And before I get started, I guess this won't work. This may, yeah. I want to take a moment just to highlight how cognitively taxing spontaneous speech is. I mean, if you think about all of the different processes required for me to produce the words that I'm producing right now, it's actually quite extensive, right? I have to first think of some set of words to translate the set of ideas I have in my head to some set of words, right? And so this requires this vast neural network, activating this vast neural network in the brain. And once I have the set of words that I want to speak, I have to sequence them in some order that is constrained by the language. And only then can I send signals to the muscles to produce speech. And so this process begins by activating the respiratory system. So you take a deep breath, and then on exhalation you have this column of air that excites the vocal folds. And this creates this buzzing sound that we typically associate with a person's voice, right, the way it sounds. And this column of air is further shaped, colored by changes in the vocal tract, right, to produce or to convert the buzz into the different phonemes. So ah, ee, oo, ah, all of these correspond to different shapes of the vocal tract. And what we get out here is the speech signal. So we get something that we can record very easily with a cell phone, for example. Now, if there's anything that goes wrong with any of this the sequence of steps here, there is some evidence of that in the speech signal. So if you slur your words because there's some motor control issue, that becomes evident in the speech signal. If you're having word finding difficulties because of some sort of cognitive impairment, that becomes apparent in the speech signal. So really, the work that we do in my lab is trying to identify, to solve this what we call an engineering inverse problem. Given the speech signal, what is it that you can say about the person's neurological health? And really to kind of, to really accentuate and drive this point home, I love this video. This is a sagittal view of someone speaking. You can see their vocal tract here, and it's synchronized to their speech. So I'd like to play this video, and then I'll have a few comments about it on the other side. Okay, so this worked earlier.
By working hard.
Yeah.
This was easy for us. Jade may earn more money by working hard. She is thinner than I am. Bright sunshine shimmers on the ocean. Nothing is as offensive as innocence.
Indeed. So what you see here is this really precise coordination between several different muscles, about 100 different muscles required to produce the speech that we record here. And you have this really intricate sort of dance between the articulators, right? You have this velopharyngeal flap, for example, that's opening and closing to allow airflow or to modulate airflow between our oral cavity and our nasal cavity. So when we say m, the air flows through the nose. When we say ah, it flows through the mouth. And so if there is a disturbance in any region of the brain, for example, that is responsible for motor control or for speech motor control, then we can we can detect these changes in the speech signal. So as I mentioned, this talk will really be about what is it that we can say about the neurological health of the speaker by looking at clinically relevant changes in the speech. So the first obvious question is, why speech? I mean, speech isn't the only thing we do. We walk, we move our hands. So there's several reasons for this. The most obvious one is at any given point in time, we have 3 or 4 microphones around us, 2 in our pockets, 1 in front of me here, several at home. And so it's really easy to collect. I mean, just from sort of things that we do every day, the average person writes about 41,000 words in emails and about 30,000 words in text messages per year. So it's like the equivalent of 2 novels. 2 novels no one would ever want to read. But it's a lot of data. I mean, this is a fingerprint of neurological health. And then if you expand beyond language and look at speech, it's another about 156 hours. So the NSA has a really nice footprint of your neurological health. Typically, we don't record phone calls. This is kind of the most obvious answer to the question of why, but there's another answer, and that's that there's a large body of work that relates changes in the brain to changes in the speech signal. And I'd like to sort of define a little bit about what I mean by speech and language, at least in the context of this presentation. So when I say speech, I'm really referring to the way the speech sounds. Is it slurred? Is it monotone? How fast is it in terms of speaking rate? Is it hypernasal? I mentioned this velopharyngeal flap earlier that modulates airflow between the oral and the nasal cavity. Is that functioning properly, or am I getting leakage of air, for example, through the nasal cavity when I shouldn't be? So these are all sort of constellations of speech features that are relevant for different neurological disorders. In fact, I mentioned this large body of work. This is just a table I picked out this morning from a book by Joe Duffy on motor speech disorders, Clues to Neurologic Diagnosis. And what you have is a different dysarthria subtype, or a different collection of these speech features associated with different lesion loci in the brain. So different lesions in the brain give rise to different representations or different disturbances in the speech signal. So this has been well studied since before the 60s. It was sort of formalized in the 70s. And you can hear this yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play 2 speech samples. In the first sample, the person has ALS. In the second, the person has Parkinson's disease. And then I'll make a few comments about them.
The supermarket chain shut down because of poor management.
The supermarket chain shut down because of poor management.
Supermarket chain shut down because of poor management.
Right, so there are clear differences between the 2 speakers, obviously. Some of the differences come about because they're different speakers. One is a male, one is a female, so there's idiosyncratic differences in speaking style. But there are clinically relevant differences between the 2, right? So in both cases, there was reduced articulatory precision. There was a little bit of slurring. In the first case, there was a hint of hypernasality and some vocal quality issues. In the second, there was the speech was a bit breathy. So I'll play these again and.
The supermarket chain shut down because of poor management.
The supermarket chain shut down because of poor management.
The other the other thing I forgot to mention about the second speaker is there's also a rhythmic disturbance. There's I'll talk about sort of prosody a bit later, but the idea is that in English we have stressed and unstressed syllables. And in the case of the second speaker, these differences became less pronounced.
The supermarket.
Okay. So the other part of this is language, what we say rather than how we say it. So that there are any sort of neurological disorder where one of the symptoms is cognitive impairment. You can see these sorts of changes manifest themselves in the resultant speech signal in different ways, right? So reduced speech output, a smaller vocabulary size, lower idea density. There's a study many years ago by Snowden looking at changes in idea density in nuns in a particular convent that eventually went on to get Alzheimer's disease versus those that didn't. So the idea density is the number of unique ideas expressed in some fixed set of text or some fixed number of words. And the last the last I have on my slide here is semantic coherence. So if you look at the semantic content in one sentence and compare it to the semantic content of the next sentence, how consistent are they? Or word salad is sort of the more general term that some people use. You see this in formal thought disorder or patients with schizophrenia, for example. There's a shifting of topic to topic. So here's kind of just one simple example from the literature looking at a measure of language complexity in two groups. So this is a group of cognitively healthy individuals between the ages of 66 and 84. If you look at language complexity and how that changes, you see this sort of slight decline. There's a small slope there that comes about from aging. And then if you compare those curves with these waterfall curves from individuals with dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, you see a rather rapid decline in language complexity, again, largely caused by the cognitive impairment. Today, that sort of sets the stage for what I'll talk about today. And I'm really going to talk about 4 case studies initially, and then some collaborative work we've done with some folks in industry and also at Mayo Clinic in BNI, Barrow Neurological Institute. So the first 2 case studies really deal, or actually all 4 case studies deal with retrospective data. It's very difficult to get preclinical data, especially when you're just starting out in a particular area. So because speech is so prevalent and widely available, we looked at public figures that eventually were diagnosed with some neurological disorder, went back in time with the internet and downloaded audio files over the years and looked at changes in their speech and language patterns consistent with what we would expect in their particular disorder. So the first was Muhammad Ali looking at changes in his speech before his Parkinsonism diagnosis in 1984. The second is something similar for Michael J. Fox, looking at changes in his speech prior to his Parkinson's diagnosis in 91. And this particular one is hot off the press. In fact, we just submitted it, so we can talk about it later if you like. And the second pair, those first 2 deal with speech. We're looking at Parkinsonism and Parkinson's disease. And the second pair of case studies, we're looking at language. So changes in language complexity for another famous figure, again, President Ronald Reagan, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 94. And the fourth is looking to see if there's early signs of language complexity decline in a group of individuals that are at risk for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So NFL players, are there any observable changes in that population? So each one of these, if you're interested in the papers, feel free to download them, or I can send them to you in the case of the second paper that has yet to be published. Okay, so let's get started on the first one. So looking at changes in speech in Muhammad Ali. This study came about because we were contacted by Jonathan Ike, who just published this book last year, a biography of Ali's life. And he had seen some of our previous work and was interested in seeing whether we could detect changes that were clinically relevant in Ali's speech over the years. And he said, I have this list here of interviews that he had done before. And we'd love to give them to you and see if you can find anything. So of course we jumped on this. We thought this was a really interesting study. And talk briefly about the methods. The slide hurts me because it's a lot of work going into one slide with 3 bullets. This took the longest time. Yeah. So really what we did is for every single interview, these were interviews back and forth with Ali and some interviewers. So the first step is speaker diarization, identifying the parts of the speech signal where it's only Ali speaking. And this was done using a combination of automatic and manual methods. The second is from the parts of speech where it was only Ali speaking, having some measure of articulatory precision. So because of the quality of the data, this is data over an extended period of time where recording quality changed. Some of the samples were from the 60s. We wanted a measure that was robust to process with respect to the data, but also that had been shown in the literature to be correlated with articulatory precision. So one such measure is the vowel space area, which I'll talk a bit about later. And we also wanted a measure of prosody. So we know that there are prosodic changes that result from Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonism, in particular changes in speaking rate and changes in intonational variability. So he was a very animated guy. So changes in how animated he was with his speech over time. So I'll sort of show the largest effect here first. What we have here is on the y-axis, we have his speaking rate in the number of syllables per second. On the x-axis is the year during which the interview was done. And every single one of these points is an interview. And again, it's only samples of him speaking. So you have his speaking rate going from about 5.1 syllables per second in 1968 down to somewhere around 3 in 1981. He was diagnosed officially with Parkinsonism in 1984, so that's 2 years out here. So there were clear changes that were longitudinal in nature, things that, and you can hear this, right? I mean, if you sequence these samples in the right order, you don't need fancy analytics. Yeah?
Do you see similar changes in the aging adults?
Yeah, so he was in his, I believe, late 20s all the way to early 40s here. You wouldn't expect a decline in speaking rate by almost a factor of 2 in that. Not even close, yeah. It's a good question. And so we wanted to see, so there's clearly a trend, and as I mentioned, if you just sequence these things in the right order, you can hear it yourself, so we did that exactly. So what you have here is a snippet from every single interview that was most representative of that interview in terms of syllables per second, concatenated in order.
No, sir. It's an embarrassment. I'm supposed to be free. I don't have to be.
Joe Frazier dreamed Joe Namath. If he dreamed he fall
Like that, right. Now short arms. Well, hold it now. He goes.
none of that pretty brown-skinned babies. Pakistanis love their culture. Really, yes, I think the boxing game should stay alive. I think every contender should get a shot at the title.
I think I played around for 4 or 5 rounds that I shouldn't have. And
The fight is when that happens and it's really sold out by then. But it actually puts fear in your opponent.
And a lot of times I've been in my cars in Chicago last week in Skidrow with the wine heads up, and I just ride.
well, I think I'm going to control him or help my wife to control.
Civilized and so clean and so the city is just like.
That's why people are so shocked when I lost to Frazier. No excuses. He won.
I'm a Democrat and a Republican, so I'd rather not see man named Catholic until it clashes with the mentality, which is down here. And I was fighting.
Yeah, that last half second was after his diagnosis, but everything before was before. Prior to that was before.
Your line is really deceptive. It looks to me like the speech was constant until 1976 and then abruptly fell off.
Yeah,
and you're
yeah.
trying to imply with that line that it was smooth.
Yeah, so what I'm implying with that line is that it's difficult to do anything more than linear analysis on data that's so sparse. But you can fit some sort of step curve to it, and that's probably more appropriate if you look at the anecdotal evidence. I mean, there was actually a lot of anecdotal evidence after a particular fight in 1974 or 5 or something like that, where there was kind of a rapid decline.
Well, I'd say even a linear analysis, that is, you've got all these data points above your line before 76, but just 2 below it. Okay, so then there's 68. I wouldn't even fit a linear curve to that,
What-
up to 76.
Okay, so is there a curve that you would fit to it? Or-
Yeah, step function.
Yeah.
A what?
So then you'd have a bunch of points above and below the step function as well.
No, you'd have, if you ran it at 4.8,
Yeah.
until 76, it looks like about an equal number above and below.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
As a psychologist, I'm happy fitting the linear.
As a physicist, I'm not.
I appreciate that. Maybe a step function. But I heard a lot of other things like this, and there's reasons, I'm sure, for just looking at the speaking rate, but the dynamic range and the pitch range certainly drop off as well.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll get to the dynamic range of the pitch range. So there's an analysis that we have on pitch variability as well. I mean, I was expecting a complaint like, "Hey, why are you looking at this linearly?" The guy was getting hit periodically. That's a major confound here. And in fact, we took that into account specifically when we looked at changes in prosody.
Did you plot his fights on here as well?
Yeah. So we'll get to it. So in addition, as you correctly pointed out, it wasn't just speaking rate. What you actually had is a reduction in articulatory precision. I mean, there was actually a reduction, if you sort of imagine him speaking, in the dynamic range of the articulators and how wide he was opening his mouth when he was speaking, how much he was moving his tongue. And one way to capture that acoustically is by looking at something that we call the vowel space area. So the vowel space area gives you a sense of how distinct the vowels are when they're spoken. So if I say ah, e, u, ah, those are very distinct. If I say e, u, those are, what you have is vowel centralization. So they sort of collapse on some center. So we looked at precisely because of this sort of step function type difference that was noticed by one of our colleagues here. We looked at the vowel space area pre-1978 and post-1978. This was done in effect to fill out the vowel spaces for computational reasons. And we plot the first formant and the second formant without going into details about what that means. What you see is that one of these polygons is much smaller than the other one. What you have is more vowel centralization, so the vowels sound more like each other. And very loosely speaking, this compression in the first formant implies that there's less movement of the jaw, and compression in the second formant implies there's less movement of the tongue. And so this is actually consistent with what you hear when you listen as well. But as I mentioned, one of the biggest confounds here is that there's this whole other thing that was superimposed on the data, which is the fact that he was periodically fighting. And you would expect that both the TBI and getting hit in the face would probably change the way that you're able to produce speech. So we worked with a boxing analytics company to go in and identify the number of times he was hit in every single fight, and whether it was a jab or a power punch. And so this then sort of completes the picture in some sense. What we can do now is do a multivariate model where we look at not just longitudinal changes, but longitudinal changes combined with information about the last fight, including the number of rounds it went, the number of jabs that were landed, the number of power punches that were landed, and the number of days that had elapsed since the last fight. And we look at two measures, again, the speaking rate and the pitch range. And what you notice that's sort of interesting is that this pitch range, the variable that is most predictive of changes in pitch range is this the number of days that had elapsed since the last fight. So the more time that has elapsed since the last fight, the more animated he is with his speech. And with speaking rate, the sort of variable that drives the model is still age, so there's more of a persistent decline in speaking rate. Again, this is a linear model, not a logistic model, as was earlier suggested that we use. So that's sort of the first case study where you can see some longitudinal trends that are consistent with what you would expect from someone that's showing signs of Parkinsonism. The second, and sort of the one that's more hot off the press, is this work on with Michael J. Fox, One of the limitations of the Ali study is the quality of the data. You can really do only these simple sorts of measures, looking at formant frequencies and vowels. When you have data that's been recorded over a period of time using very high quality equipment, like is used in movies, for example, you can do much more nuanced analysis. So we did this with a series of shows and movies that we had from Michael J. Fox from 1982 to 1991. These were before he was diagnosed. He first started noticing signs. This is from a study. This is from an article. He noticed some interesting changes. His pinky finger wouldn't stop twitching. That was during the filming of Doc Holliday, and then he was diagnosed a year afterwards. It would be an additional year before he had a diagnosis. And I took this this quote that he had made about as they were, I believe, as they were titrating his medication, he started noticing changes in his speech that he found to be disturbing. So, because the quality of the data was much higher, here we could actually do more interesting work. We could look at changes in the precise articulation of individual phonemes and individual looking at both consonants and vowels. But to do this, we needed to do some pre-processing first. Again, as in the previous with the previous data, we do speaker diarization where we split the data so that it's only his speech. We do automatic transcription using speech recognition, and then looking at vowel and consonant precision separately. Because of the data quality, we can also look at the phonation signal. So just like you would expect, for example, someone with Parkinson's disease to have, if you look at their cadence, their gait, looking at the periodicity of their gait, there's some jitter there. It's not quite as consistent. You tend to see the same thing with the opening and closing of the vocal folds, that there's jitter in that period. And we looked at some measures of prosody, again, speaking rate, intonational variability. And because we're able to do this syllable level analysis, we can look at a measure of rhythm that is known to be disturbed by Parkinson's disease, and specifically looking at changes in stress. So different words in English have different places of stress. So for example, the word about, you have a weak versus a strong syllable. So looking at in Parkinson's disease, these distinctions between weak and strong syllables tend to be blurry. So here is the data again from the movie, from the set of movies for all of these variables. This is just simple correlations with age. And you have the R value and the P value, and roughly speaking, we're looking at prosody, phonation, and articulation. What's interesting to note is obviously not all of these reach statistical significance, but the direction is exactly what you'd expect in every single variable for someone that with Parkinson's disease. There's reduced intonational variability over time. Speech becomes more monotone. There's a reduced stress to unstressed ratio, so these stressed syllables start looking more like unstressed syllables, or unstressed syllables start looking more like stressed syllables. So there's disturbed rhythm. There's really no changes in speaking rate that we can really speak of. There's increased jitter over time, so that there's less precise opening and closing of the vocal folds. And the strongest effect here is reduced articulatory precision. This is averaged over consonants and vowels, although if you split them up, you can see reduced precision in both consonants and vowels. And that one had sort of the strongest effect, so you can just plot it here to look at the trend. What you have here is the year the movie was released, which means it was actually recorded a year before approximately, and the articulatory precision measure. The lower the value the higher in magnitude, the lower in actual value, the lower the articulation. So the values closer to 0 are more precise speech. Yeah.
Being a little bit provocative here, but if you were simply looking at the data from the perspective of a speech person, and you didn't have any other information, would you say these two people had the same disease?
No, I don't think you could make any definitive claims just by looking at the data about whether or not they, there's no diagnosis that you could make using just speech, right? So that what you would say is you'd be able to say that there's a reduction, for example, in speaking rate over time, or there's a reduction in articulatory precision over time. I mean, the way that speech-based features are used in diagnosis, for example, let's take Mayo Clinic. It's really a team approach, right? Someone sees a neurologist because they detect some change, and the neurologist, to make a formal diagnosis, will work with a speech-language pathologist, for example, to get a sense of what the dysarthria subtype is to help inform a final diagnosis. But there's no way you can make a speech-based diagnosis by itself, yeah.
Just sort of follow this point.
Yeah.
Again, you just look at I don't know, let's look at the purple points from 85 to 90. If he were coming to your clinic during that time, following your pathologist example, it looks like his data over those 5 years, I don't know, the last 3 or kind of in the middle of that.
Yeah.
There's really a lot in these.
That's right. So when you have a sparse set of data points, for example, only those required collected during in-clinic visits, it becomes really difficult to measure neurological health. So you might have, even if you had a very high precision instrument like an MRI, if you have one MRI every 2 years, that's still a very sparse data set. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is because speech acquisition is so easy, that you're not limited to just 5 or 10 points. I mean, if you imagine in some instance of the world in the future where you can actually do this every day rather than for every movie that you recorded, you'd get a much more precise estimate of change as a function of time. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So those were related to the acoustics of speech. Now here we're looking at changes in language in individuals that were, well, in this case in President Reagan, who was eventually diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So here we have data from the Presidential Archive. We can go back and look at the 46 press conferences that he gave and specifically focus on just the Q&A in those conferences. So every single press conference begins with some open statement that someone writes, but then there is an open Q&A that requires answering questions on the spot. And so we only use the spontaneous Q&A part of this, and we look at some measures of language complexity that have been shown over several studies to be reliable for detecting mild cognitive impairment or detecting cognitive linguistic impairment in individuals with dementia of different types, frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, I'll talk about that measure on the next slide here. And then we wanted to compare this against the president that was closest in age, who also happened to be closest in terms of sequence in presidency, which was George Herbert Walker Bush. So the method here is actually very, very simple. This is, we had access to the transcripts here, so we can look at this type to token ratio. This has been used across many, many studies, and the reason that we opted for a very simple measure is because we had very simple data and a small amount of it. So looking at the number of unique words calculated per 1,000 words. So in other words, if you look at a set of, if you look at a body of text, what is the number of non-repeating words there? So if you look at what I have here, what I've highlighted in red are the words that are repeated multiple times. So if you look at the words that are, count the number of unique words in this paragraph, that would be the type to token ratio. And what you have, if you look at the changes between Reagan compared to Bush, you notice this, decline in this unique word count, or this type to token ratio over the duration of his presidency, and a flat line for Bush here. The comparison isn't really fair in the sense that Bush was only president for 4 years versus Reagan was president for 8 years, but we can't change the past. So we made do with the data that we had. What is interesting is he gave I think double the number of conferences in half the time for some reason. Yeah.
Why is it plotted as transcript index instead of time?
Yeah, it's the plot that I could find last night. So you can plot it over time. You get the same trend. These are approximately uniformly distributed over the course of his presidency. Yeah. Yeah.
What if you looked at, I mean, maybe you did this, but windowing the type of token? Because I was noticing in the speech that you showed, there's a lot of repeated words, but there's also a lot of repeated pair phrases. So you could think year could be used in the context of this year, it could also be used like every year. Maybe somebody's like wearing out that way, but here you see a lot of this year, training camp. And so maybe a windowed.
So it depends on what you mean by windowed, because it was windowed in the sense that these were calculated for every 1,000 words, because the type to token ratio correlates with the amount of text. I mean, if I have the opportunity to speak more words, I'll have more unique words.
Well, yeah. Windowed, like, so looking at one word, repeated for 1,000 words, or
Yeah.
a two-word phrase repeated as a two-word phrase
Right.
for 1,000 or three-word, etc.
So looking at a 2 gram versus a 1 gram representation. Yeah, certainly could have done that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was waiting for that question. It always comes up. So I guess my answer to that is that there would likely be a floor effect. No, so the short answer is I don't think his speech has changed very much over the last 10 years. Yeah.
Huge speech.
Yeah.
Do you think that you have or will have, in terms of statistical significance, an ability to look at the efficacy of like a drug treatment on a disease state?
Yeah. I mean, so the last part of the talk after we're finished with these is actually, we've included these in as endpoints in several clinical trials with pharma. They're used in 4 continents and 6 different languages now. So the short answer to your question is yes, not as a diagnostic. I mean, the whole point of doing this is not to diagnose, but as a thermometer for speech, right? As a way of objectively assessing changes in speech. And when you have the option to elicit speech samples rather than go back in time and analyze speech samples, then you can jointly optimize what you're asking people to do with the analytics. And that's exactly the approach that we've taken.
So you have enough accuracy that's a good model.
Yeah. You can. I mean, we have some data that's not here, but shows that in order to sort of achieve the same level of accuracy in measuring some of these different dimensions, you need, on average, 2 to 3 clinicians to average their ratings, their subjective ratings, to achieve the same level of accuracy. Yeah. The final case study is looking at changes in complexity decline in NFL players. So this came about because I had a student that was an avid follower of the NFL, and as it turns out, 11 NFL teams make publicly available the pre and post game transcripts from every single game. So he figured out during the summer how to go in and download all of these, and by the end of that effort, we had about 10,000 transcripts from 10 players and 18 front office professionals who have actually never played football. So it made for an interesting comparison group. And if you look at the actual speech, it's about 1,000 hours of continuous speech. And 8 of the 10 players were actually still active as of the 2018 season. And here, again, we looked at 2 very simple measures. The second is this type to token ratio. The first is this lexical density measure. It's looking at the content words per fixed number of words. It's a proxy for this idea density that Snowden used in his original paper when working with the nuns. So 2 very simple measures, looking at them within subject over time, right? There's idiosyncratic differences in the way that people speak and how large their vocabulary is. What we're interested in here is the slope over time. And comparing these two groups. So we use a mixed effects model where we look at both this type to token ratio and the lexical density and look at changes in the slope to see whether or not there's any association with player status. So does the fact that you're actively playing in the NFL mean that you have or more likely to have a more negative slope? And you see that this is the case for both the type to token ratio and the lexical density. If you look at the internals of this model, kind of the visualization that I like the most is if you plot the slopes for the control group and for the players, you see this sort of diverging trend, right? For most of the front office executives, the slopes are positive or close to zero, and for the majority of the players, they trend in the opposite direction. And if you do a further dive, you know the media always wants to interview the quarterbacks. So you can look for the quarterbacks looking at the magnitude of the slope against the number of sacks per game. So how as a proxy for how often they're hit. There's maybe some trend there. I don't know if there is or not. I just it's sort of an interesting analysis.
If you go the other way, you get sacked more because they are mentally.
Fair enough. Yeah. This is research methods 101. Yeah. So that sort of brings us to the end of these 4 case studies. I'm going to take just a 1-slide detour, which is here's a picture of a player and the quote. I'll let you read them both, or I'll let you read the quote. So this slide actually has nothing to do with my presentation. I just find it interesting. So neither of these are real. This person was produced by a generative adversarial network. So it's this idea of using deep fakes to generate people that don't actually exist. And this speech was something that one of my students trained using this neural network, this long short-term memory, where you try to capture the statistics of what pre- and post-game conferences sound like, so then you ask the machine a question and you get a bunch of text that is consistent with the statistics of what the pre- and post-game interviews look like. As I mentioned, this slide doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the talk. I just thought it might be interesting to talk about and sort of as to cleanse the palate before we move on to the next stuff. Yeah. Oh, I have a few more. Do I have time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So that, as I mentioned earlier, I like talking about these because people generally find them interesting, but scientifically they're not all that interesting. You can it's interesting that you can detect these trends over time. They're consistent with what you'd expect. But what we're really interested in doing is seeing whether we can do this over a large scale or on a large scale for some clinically useful application. So we start with publicly available data, and the question the answer to the question why is because it's available, and preclinical data is hard, but also it actually provides a real challenge to the analytics. I mean, all of this, or most of this stuff is done automatically, and if you can do this with data from the wild, then you can do it in more controlled settings. So the recent work has really focused on designing custom elicitation tasks that optimally tax the cognitive linguistic system. So asking people to read specific sentences that are phonemically balanced, or asking them questions that are cognitively taxing, and matching the analytics with these. And in particular, we've sort of developed three panels of speech measures. I measured this idea of thermometer for speech, but those that measure motor control, those for cognitive linguistics, and then affect. If you ask people to describe a picture that is meant to elicit a particular emotion, you can get a sense of what their response is in terms of the valence as estimated by the acoustics, and then also the sentiment of the words that they use. So we've divided this simple application. It's a mobile app. You get a snapshot of the background noise to account for the different environments in which people would use the app. We have a set of motor stimuli, cognition stimuli, and affect stimuli, and these are recorded and sent to a secure cloud server, and then we have our analytics that generate a report, and really the report is sort of centered around these 3 different areas. So motor control, cognitive linguistics, and affective measures. So for motor, we looked at some of these already. For cognition, we look at semantic complexity, syntactic complexity, semantic coherence. And then for affect, again, valence based on the acoustics, but then also sentiment based on the words that are used to describe these concepts. And they're not very time consuming. You know, the motor measures take about 3 to 5 minutes to complete, or the tasks. The cognitive piece, again, about 3 to 5 minutes, and the affective piece, about 2 to 4 minutes. I won't go into the details here of since I'm running out of time here, but we've also started doing a little bit of work with looking at measuring affect from facial features, but really this is more of a side project. Our bread and butter is really speech and language analytics. And as I mentioned, we've done this on a large scale in some cases, on smaller scale in others, but there's this growing body of work in neurology. There's a great interest in being able to detect early signs of decline, be they motor decline or cognitive linguistic decline, in order, as the last speaker said, to stratify patients in clinical trials, for example. One of the reasons there hasn't been, or it's hypothesized there hasn't been a successful Alzheimer's trial is because a lot of the patients, the participants in these trials don't have Alzheimer's disease. The earlier that you can get them, and the earlier and the better that you can stratify them, the smaller sample sizes in these trials. So we've worked with several pharmaceutical companies to distribute these on a fairly large scale across many different conditions, and I'll highlight a couple of the results here. So this is some work that we've done with Barrow Neurological Institute, looking at changes, or looking at whether we can monitor changes in patients with ALS at home. So these are folks with ambulatory constraints. Having them come to clinic is not ideal, and there's variation in sort of their symptoms. So being able to measure these at home over time is interesting. Here we were looking at two groups. We gave the app to about 100 patients with ALS, and asked them to provide speech samples on a daily basis. And we looked at two of the measures from this, and we were comparing one group in particular, those that are that have ALS but have no clinical symptoms associated with their speech, as measured by this functional rating scale that's currently used as a part of a diagnostic package for ALS. And then looking at this application, and what you see, and then comparing them to healthy controls. So what you see is, despite the fact that clinically these two groups look identical, if you know the healthy controls have no symptoms in speech, the ALS folks have no symptoms in speech, they're wildly different if you look at just two of the measures of this speech thermometer, the articulatory precision and the average vowel length. So there's a big difference between the two groups, and you can look at the ROC curves as well and see that you can classify between these two groups using a very small number of features because they're more precise than clinical rating scales are. And you can also, because you have longitudinal data, you can track their speech over time perceptually. So here's the same person repeating the same word over time, and you can notice this pattern of degradation as they're progressing through ALS.
Management, 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 management.
So you can notice a decline in speaking rate and also in articulatory precision towards the end there.
Management.
So the second is completely different. This is looking at changes in this thermometer as a reliable premonitory predictor of an oncoming migraine. Migraine is interesting because it's one of the few disorders where you can do something about it before a migraine hits. So we looked at patients with migraine without aura, so that they had no way that they were going to get a migraine that was coming on. We asked them to collect these speech samples 3 times daily and looked at whether there was changes in speech before they actually realized they were having a migraine. Without getting into the differences here, the short answer was There was changes in speaking rate, articulation rate, and this measure of articulatory precision called articulation entropy that were early indicators that a migraine was coming, and those changed as early as 12 hours in advance of the migraine, so that people could actually take the medication to try and prevent an oncoming migraine. So that brings us to the last slide here. There's lots of insight that we can gain about neurological health by analyzing the speech signal, mostly because it's actually a cognitively very taxing process, producing spontaneous speech. And the fact that it's so easy to measure means that we can increase the sampling frequency, so we get data from individuals on a daily basis, multiple times a day. And potentially could even be done passively, right? I mean, with the number of at-home devices that have microphones now, you might imagine some pattern of neurological health being tracked passively and persistently over time. So provides complementary information to other modalities as well, balance and eye tracking and so on. There's many different objective outcomes that are useful in clinical context. So I think the idea here is not so much speech-based diagnostics as it is an instrument to precisely measure changes in speech in clinically relevant ways. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
A comment and a question. So the comment is that someone like Michael J. Fox, early in his career, is doing 30-minute fast-paced television programs. Later in his career, a much bigger mix of 2-hour movies, where presumably the speech could be artificially, by the director, slowed. So that's an uncontrolled variable that's in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncontrolled variables in all of those studies. I mean, I totally agree with you.
And then the question, it's an institutional review board question based on experience that I had. So you're providing medical data on a living person without his permission. Is that?
This is interesting. So I think you bring up a really good point, and the point is that IRB needs to be revised. So when we put in for permission to do, for example, the NFL study, we told them exactly what we were going to do, and they said, yeah, this is exempt because the data is publicly available. And we told them that the data was actually going to be anonymized, which it was, and they actually said the whole thing is exempt. So there's this gray area here. I don't have a good answer to your question, except for this is a big blind spot for IRB.
It is. I came into my IRB was on the other side of the gray, where even though the data was public and white, we have problems.
Yeah.
So based on that question, have you looked at getting or thought about people using Amazon's and Google's perpetually stored audio data from people?
Yeah, I don't know that we want to go down that route. That opens up a can of worms. We're very happy going through sort of the traditional IRB process, designing our own applications and knowing where the data lives. I certainly think that would be that's academically interesting. It's a little scary to think how much Amazon and Google and Facebook know about us. When you think of the terabytes of data that they can mine to look at neurological trends in health, for example. But we haven't personally pursued that. Yeah.
So I'm
Mentioning, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to make a sarcastic comment. I shouldn't mention football at ASU. We haven't done so well. The good news is, 30 years ago, the running back for the national champion team is named Benny Malone. He went on to play for the Miami Dolphins for many years. And he wanted to stay active in local sports, so he put together these beautiful T-shirts that you have. Small fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How about that? It is.
Yeah. They retired his number in the whole game.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's actually that's cool.
I just have a thought and a question.
Yeah.
The thought is on Ronald Reagan and Michael J. Fox, and you probably already thought of this, but because of their skill set in relation to their careers, how much were they able to compensate for what they were noticing before it manifested itself in the transcripts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, there's obviously no way of knowing, but with respect to what's out there, Michael J. Fox, for example, his point was that the first symptom that he noticed was the pinky, and the speech changes came, at least as far as the ones that he could notice, well after his diagnosis, which is not. It's not crazy, right? I mean, most people, when they listen to speech, they're listening for content and not necessarily for the precise way in which specific phonemes are articulated. But yeah, I mean, there could be a confound due to the, I mean, President Reagan could have found it, you know,